Night had settled over the English Channel in the late months of 1942, the kind of thick, moonless darkness that crews once believed shielded them from detection. The Luftwaffe bombers flew low and steady, convinced that British tracking systems were too primitive to find them in such conditions. For years, German engineers had confidently dismissed Allied radar as unreliable at night and nearly useless against dispersed formations. But on this night, something felt different. The crews sensed a pressure in the air, a tension that had not been present in earlier missions. In the distance, faint arcs of tracer fire spiraled upward, cutting through the sky like thin red lines etched into black paper. That alone was not unusual, but the precision of their origin was. The fire wasn't random or probing. It moved deliberately, as if guided by an unseen hand. Allied night fighters were aligning themselves with uncanny accuracy, adjusting altitude and speed with a confidence no Luftwaffe crew expected. To the German pilots, it felt as though the British could somehow see through the darkness. Inside the cockpit of an RAF Mosquito night fighter, the glow of early airborne radar equipment, AI Mark IV, illuminated the crew's instruments with a dim, ghostly blue. The needles shifted in subtle increments, responding to returns from a bomber many miles ahead. The operator tracked it calmly, calling out range and bearing in measured, practiced intervals. Although the system was still primitive by modern standards, its ability to guide interceptors toward enemy aircraft at night was revolutionary, and for the Axis, deeply unsettling. Above the coast, chain-home radar towers stood silent and skeletal, their massive structures catching only faint starlight. These tall masts, once underestimated by German analysts, had been quietly reshaping the air war for years. Their early warning coverage extended over 100 miles, detecting incoming aircraft long before the bombers crossed the channel. While German engineers insisted the system was too crude to be meaningful, British operators were already triangulating altitude, heading, and speed. The night was no longer an ally to the attackers. Far below, coastal command rooms buzzed with coordinated motion. Radar plots were pushed across long tables, markers updated in rapid succession as operators relayed readings. Controllers synchronized fighter vectors with incoming radar tracks, shaping an interception plan with methodical precision. Each adjustment, each command, each timing call was based on data invisible to the bombers overhead. The Luftwaffe could not see the system working, but they would soon feel its consequences. As the German formation pressed deeper into British airspace, one bomber after another reported strange, rhythmic disturbances, brief moments when their onboard radios crackled or their navigational readings shifted slightly. They dismissed it at first as atmospheric interference. But then the first interception occurred. A Mosquito dove from above with pinpoint accuracy, firing a short burst that struck a bomber's wing route. It was too accurate, too fast, too deliberate to be coincidence. Suddenly, the old assumptions began to unravel. The belief that night rendered radar useless was collapsing in real time. Axis engineers had once written dismissive assessments, arguing that British radar systems lacked the necessary resolution to guide night fighters or track altitude reliably. Yet here, in this darkness, bombers were being located and engaged with a precision that defied those earlier judgments. Within minutes, the calm confidence of the German crews turned into a growing sense of dread. The unseen force guiding British fighters was not luck, nor was it guesswork. It was a technological leap, one they had underestimated, misunderstood, or ignored. And as another bomber went down in flames, the night itself seemed to flip allegiance. To understand how this moment came to be, we step back to the late 1930s, before the war, before the night skies filled with bomber streams, and long before radar shaped the fate of nations. In the years leading up to 1939, radio detection was still an emerging field, explored primarily by small, specialized groups of scientists across Europe and the United States. Britain's Chain Home Network, one of the world's first operational radar systems, stood at the forefront of this experimentation. Yet despite its promise, many foreign analysts believed it was too crude to influence real combat. The system relied on massive steel towers, some exceeding 300 feet in height, transmitting fixed-frequency radio waves. The reflections from aircraft could be detected at substantial ranges, often over 100 miles, but the data was coarse. Axis engineers who studied early reports concluded that the British could detect direction but not altitude with meaningful accuracy. In their view, a system lacking vertical precision could be outmaneuvered, especially under the concealment of night. This assumption would shape Luftwaffe air doctrine for years. When German intelligence first observed the towers along Britain's southern coastline in 1939, they interpreted them as part of a generic early warning network, not a breakthrough. Their assessments categorized Chain Home as outdated technology because it used low-frequency transmissions and static antennas. Telefunken and Gemma researchers, two major German radar firms, judged the system inferior to the Würzburg radar they were developing. They believed Britain's reliance on tall, fixed towers made the system inflexible and vulnerable. These evaluations helped reinforce the belief that the Luftwaffe could suppress or avoid radar with relative ease. During the attacks of August 12, 1940, one of the Luftwaffe's largest efforts to dismantle British early warning capabilities, German bombers struck Chain Home stations at Ventnor, Dover, Rye, and Pevensey. Damage was inflicted, but none of the radar sites were destroyed for more than a few hours. The Germans misread this resilience not as a technological achievement, but as evidence that the system was not vital enough to prioritize. In the months that followed, British radar operators refined their methods, learning to derive altitude estimates through careful interpretation of signal patterns and cross-station triangulation. German intelligence, unaware of these procedural advancements, continued basing conclusions on outdated data. The Luftwaffe took comfort in the belief that night operations would remain largely immune to radar guidance. It seemed inconceivable that a bulky early warning system could provide continuous tracking across vast stretches of darkness. Meanwhile, within Britain's scientific community, rapid improvements were underway. The integration of radar into command and control systems, including the celebrated Dowding system, made detection actionable. Intercept controllers used radar plots to vector fighter squadrons with increasing precision. Although daytime air battles drew the most public attention, night interception research quietly advanced behind the scenes, supported by engineers who understood the potential of radio waves in all weather and lighting conditions. Across the Channel, Axis engineers doubled down on their skepticism.
Technical reports circulated through Luftwaffe command, suggesting that British radar accuracy decayed sharply at night and that clutter caused by terrain would mask aircraft at lower altitudes. These conclusions were not unreasonable based on early prototypes, but they were outdated by 1941. Britain had moved far beyond the limitations Germany still assumed were in place. Thus, by the time the Luftwaffe shifted to large-scale night bombing campaigns, a vast gap had opened between perception and reality. German crews flew with confidence rooted in flawed assessments, believing darkness and dispersion would shield them from interception. But British radar, paired with new airborne systems, was on the verge of rewriting the rules of night warfare.
As night bombing intensified in late 1940 and into 1941, Britain faced a mounting crisis. The Blitz inflicted widespread destruction, and despite improvements in radar detection, the RAF struggled to stop bombers once they crossed the coastline. Fighter Command's daylight interception model did not translate cleanly into night operations. Pilots frequently reported losing sight of their targets within seconds, even when vectored directly toward them. The air defense network had the ability to detect, but not yet to consistently neutralize incoming threats. Historical fact number 1. In 1940, fewer than 5% of night bombers were intercepted successfully by the RAF fighters, despite accurate radar detection from chain home. Controllers could plot enemy tracks, but without a way to maintain visual contact, the fighters were often left flying blind in the dark. Night combat depended heavily on human eyesight, which was easily overwhelmed by darkness, cloud cover, and the glow of city fires below. The Luftwaffe exploited these weaknesses, pressing their advantage in hopes of wearing Britain down. Inside RAF command rooms, frustration mounted. Radar operators provided reliable early warning metrics, but fighter squadrons reported minimal interception results. The gap between detection and engagement became a strategic vulnerability. If Britain could not bridge this divide, the Luftwaffe's night campaign might achieve what daytime assaults could not, crippling industrial production and undermining national morale. British leadership knew the window for solving this problem was closing rapidly. Meanwhile, within Germany, analysts celebrated the perceived failure of British night defenses. Reports from bomber crews emphasized how easily they crossed the channel without encountering opposition. Axis engineers interpreted this as confirmation of their earlier conclusions. British radar was inadequate at night, and their early warning system lacked the precision needed to guide interceptors effectively. This confidence influenced German planning, encouraging deeper and more frequent penetration into British airspace. Historical fact number 2. In early 1941, the Luftwaffe launched large-scale night raids using the Kammhuber line, a defensive model the Germans believed would overwhelm any radar-dependent system. They assumed that Britain lacked the capability to track multiple bomber streams simultaneously. These assumptions were flawed. Chain Home's long-range detection capabilities were already proving resilient, and new technologies were quietly being tested to extend Britain's reach into the darkness. For Britain, the real turning point came from recognizing a fundamental truth. Early warning radar alone was not enough. The RAF needed a method to bring visibility into the night sky, something that would allow fighters to home in on enemy aircraft after the initial vector was given. This realization led to a surge of investment in airborne interception research, pushing radar technology from ground installations into the cockpits of night fighters. It was a bold leap that many doubted would succeed. Yet the pressure on the home front made experimentation unavoidable. Cities burned, factories paused production during raids, and civilian casualties mounted. The urgency of the crisis forced scientists, engineers, and air crews to collaborate in ways they hadn't before. Every new test flight, every recalibration session, and every radar echo was recorded meticulously. Britain was racing against time, knowing that if they failed to solve the night defense problem, the cost would be immeasurable. The Luftwaffe, still confident in the supposed limitations of British radar, had no idea that the real revolution was underway, not on the ground, but in the air. British airborne interception crews were preparing for a role that would soon render old assumptions obsolete. The night sky, once considered the safest path for German bombers, was about to become a far more dangerous place.
Inside Britain's radar stations, the glow of cathode ray tubes illuminated the faces of operators who worked long, silent shifts. The rooms were dim, allowing their eyes to adjust fully to the faint green lines that danced across the screens. Operators leaned forward, measuring blips that represented incoming aircraft, estimating speed and bearing through steady practice. They were not combatants in a traditional sense, yet their work shaped every interception. Each operator understood the stakes. One missed reading could mean a bomb falling on a city below. These operators formed a collective expertise rather than individual heroics. Their training taught them to filter out background noise, interpret faint returns, and detect subtle patterns in signal behavior. They knew that the Luftwaffe relied on the darkness for concealment, but they also knew radar did not sleep, nor did it blink. The cool air in the plotting rooms contrasted sharply with the urgency of their work. Every marked position, every altered vector moved the system closer to a successful interception. Meanwhile, aboard Luftwaffe bombers crossing the Channel, crews worked through rehearsed procedures. Navigators traced course lines under dim red lights, while wireless operators monitored frequencies for interference. Their expectations were shaped by earlier missions. Most had experienced minimal fighter activity at night. The prevailing belief among bomber groups was that radar could detect them only loosely, and even then, it was too imprecise to pose a consistent threat. These assumptions gave the crews a sense of routine, even during hazardous flights. However, uncertainty had begun to creep into their missions. Some crews reported unusual precision in British responses, while others noted increasing interference in their radios. They shared these observations during debriefings, but the explanations were inconsistent. Some attributed the changes to improved British searchlights, others to chance. Few believed that radar technology had advanced enough to fundamentally shift the dynamics of night warfare. Their training still emphasized that darkness favored the attacker. Behind the scenes, Britain's scientific community was executing a strategic transformation. The Airborne Interception Radar Program, AI Mark IV, had progressed from early, bulky prototypes to operational systems capable of detecting aircraft at several miles. Engineers refined magnetron components, improved antenna arrays, and optimized signal filtering to reduce false echoes. These innovations allowed radar-equipped fighters like the Bristol Beaufighter and early Mosquito models to chase targets without relying solely on visual contact. This shift represented a fundamental change in the air defense structure.
Ground-based radar provided initial detection, while airborne radar conducted the final approach. Controllers used chain-home measurements to establish vectors, then transferred responsibility to night fighter crews once they were close enough for AI radar to take over. It was a layered system: detection, tracking, vectoring, interception, each step building upon the last. The system compensated for the weaknesses of night visibility and exploited the strengths of radio wave detection. British command soon realized that night warfare required coordination unlike anything seen in daytime operations. Intercept controllers adjusted training protocols, emphasizing timing and communication discipline. Night fighter crews drilled relentlessly to synchronize their maneuvers with radar readings. In contrast, the Luftwaffe continued to rely primarily on visual navigation and assumed that radar capabilities had plateaued. The German perception of radar remained anchored to assessments made before the Blitz, while Britain's system had already entered its next evolutionary stage. From the perspective of the broader war effort, this divergence in understanding created a hidden turning point. The Luftwaffe still believed that the night sky granted them anonymity, but Britain had begun constructing an invisible architecture, an expanding web of radar coverage and encrypted communication that gradually eroded the protection the darkness once offered. The gap between what German crews assumed and what British operators could actually detect widened with every passing week.
By late 1941 and into 1942, the dynamics of the air war began shifting, subtly but unmistakably. Britain's early airborne radar systems grew more reliable, and crews became increasingly proficient in using them. Mission debriefs revealed a steady improvement in night fighter coordination, with controllers learning to anticipate German flight paths. This evolution was not yet decisive, but it marked the beginning of a pressure that German crews could sense, even if they could not fully explain it. The Luftwaffe intelligence attempted to identify the cause of the change. Reports collected from returning crews mentioned sudden encounters with fighters seemingly appearing out of nowhere. No searchlights, no moonlight guidance, no visible clues. Luftwaffe analysts speculated about improved sound detectors, enhanced coastal lookouts, or new visual tactics. Few believed radar guidance was responsible. The technology was still considered too primitive for precise nighttime interceptions. Meanwhile, British engineers continued refining the AI Mark IV radar units. Adjustments to frequency stability and antenna alignment reduced clutter and false readings. Calibration flights helped crews interpret the shifting signals more intuitively. What had once been an uncertain experimental system was maturing into a dependable tool. Britain's transition from ground-only detection to dual-layer detection, ground radar coupled with airborne radar, was altering the balance of power during night operations. In early 1942, night fighter interception rates increased from under 5% during the Blitz to approximately 15 to 20% on certain nights, depending on weather and bomber stream density. This was a dramatic change by wartime standards. For the first time, Luftwaffe crews recognized that night missions were becoming more dangerous. The assumption that British defenses were blind after sunset no longer aligned with operational realities. Inside German bomber cockpits, the shift was palpable. Crews reported hearing engine sounds in the darkness, fighters coming close enough to create audible pressure waves before attacking. Some aircraft experienced brief radar interference, causing navigational uncertainties. These moments, once rare, were now common enough to raise concerns during debriefings. The pattern indicated a growing ability of British forces to locate and intercept specific aircraft with increasing precision. By mid-1942, RAF intruder operations and night fighter patrols were contributing to the consistent loss of 3 to 5% of Luftwaffe night bombers per major raid. While these numbers may seem modest, they represented a significant strategic cost. Bomber losses at that pace threatened mission continuity, crew morale, and the Luftwaffe's long-term ability to sustain high-intensity night operations. German command attempted countermeasures, including adjustments to flight altitudes, staggered formations, and variations in ingress routes. However, these strategies provided inconsistent results. The Luftwaffe had underestimated the adaptability of the British system. They still viewed radar as a fixed ground-based technology, not as a dynamic combination of detection, coordination, and airborne engagement working in harmony. At RAF bases, the tension was rising as well. Night fighter crews operated under immense pressure, knowing that every successful intercept could prevent destruction on the ground. They studied radar plots before missions, memorizing likely bomber corridors and preparing their AI radar sets meticulously. For many crews, the steady rise in interception success validated the system's potential. Britain was no longer reacting blindly to night raids. It was beginning to shape the battlefield in the darkness. Across the Channel, Luftwaffe planners sensed that something had changed but lacked the data to fully diagnose it. Their earlier assessments of British radar had given them confidence, but now the evidence contradicted those conclusions. The night sky was no longer a safe corridor. The invisible advantage the Luftwaffe had enjoyed was slipping away, replaced by a sense of vulnerability that grew with every mission. This escalation did not yet represent a decisive turning point, but it was the prelude to one. The stage was set for a moment when the Luftwaffe would discover definitively that British radar was not the outdated system they once mocked. It was an evolving weapon that could reach into the darkness with increasing accuracy. The real revelation was about to arrive.
The decisive moment arrived on the night of 30 to 31 May 1942, during one of the largest RAF bombing operations to date, the first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne. While history often remembers this event for the scale of the Allied offensive, it also exposed a critical shift in nighttime air power. As Luftwaffe night fighters scrambled to respond, a surprising pattern emerged. British night fighter activity displayed a level of precision that German crews had never seen before. The systems Britain had been refining in secrecy were now showing their full capability. 1945 hours. Chain home stations detected Luftwaffe fighter assemblies rising from bases in the Low Countries. 22:10 hours. RAF intercept controllers linked early warning data with airborne tracking reports, forming a detailed picture of German response movements. 22:30 hours. Radar operators began vectoring Mossies and Beaufighters into positions far ahead of the incoming German formations. This timeline demonstrated what German intelligence had failed to account for: the speed at which Britain could convert detection into interception. Initially, Luftwaffe crews assumed the heightened activity was coincidental, a temporary concentration of British patrols. They were unaware that British ground radar, coastal radar, and airborne radar had merged into a comprehensive network. Each returning signal was cross-referenced, refined, and relayed back to pilots with unprecedented speed. The Germans believed Britain relied mostly on searchlights and sound locators, systems that were increasingly irrelevant in radar-guided operations. 23:20 hours. AI Mark IV sets aboard RAF night fighters began receiving solid returns at several miles range. Operators tracked German night fighters dispersing to protect Cologne. Unlike earlier interceptions that required visual confirmation, crews now closed the distance rapidly, trusting their instruments. The radar displays, simple scopes with blips and arcs, provided enough accuracy to guide fighters directly into attack positions without visual cues.
The breakthrough came when RAF crews successfully engaged German night fighters that were actively maneuvering, something previously considered nearly impossible at night. For the first time, German pilots reported being intercepted while climbing, turning, or shifting altitude, actions once believed to break tracking. These accounts stunned Luftwaffe analysts. Radar could no longer be dismissed as imprecise. It was demonstrating real-time tracking capability. By midnight, Luftwaffe crews were experiencing a threat they had not anticipated. Their defensive maneuvers, banking, diving, splitting formations offered little protection. Reports from multiple airfields described night fighters being found in darkness without searchlights, an admission that contradicted prior assumptions. Behind every sudden encounter was a network of operators, controllers, and airborne radar crews working in tight synchronization. The events of this night became a reference point within the Luftwaffe. The idea that British radar was too primitive for complex night operations could no longer be sustained. The precision of RAF interceptions forced German analysts to revisit earlier intelligence assessments. They started to realize that Britain had achieved something unprecedented, an integrated night defense system combining long-range detection, centralized tracking, and airborne targeting. Strategic impact. Although the night's main historical focus rests on the bombing of Cologne, its secondary consequence was equally significant. The Luftwaffe discovered that British radar had matured into a weaponized system capable of reshaping night operations. From this point onward, darkness no longer protected German aircraft as it once had. The turning point had arrived, not through a single technological leap, but through a decade of incremental advancements converging at the perfect moment.
High above the darkened countryside, a Mosquito night fighter banked gently as the airborne radar operator called out closing distance. The pilot adjusted throttle and trim, trusting the AI Mark IV readings more than the faint silhouettes outside. The night was calm, but the instruments buzzed with tension. Each blip on the scope meant a real aircraft, real danger, and a chance to blunt the Luftwaffe's night strategy. Crews had learned to move by instruments first, eyes second. Far below, in a chain-home station, operators tracked the same bomber stream the Mosquito was closing in on. Their scopes showed arcs stretching across the channel, confirming both altitude ranges and estimated speeds. They coordinated with sector controllers, who relayed updates to airborne fighters. Every adjustment, 1 degree left, 50 feet of altitude correction, slight speed change, was part of a synchronized effort. These operators were unseen by the air crews they guided, yet central to the unfolding battle. Inside a German U-88 bomber, the wireless operator monitored frequencies for guidance signals and interference. What he found instead unsettled him. Periodic pulses disrupting his equipment, subtle but rhythmic. The navigator traced their path on the map, still assuming they were beyond Britain's accurate reach. But something felt wrong. Moments earlier, he had seen the faint glimmer of tracer fire arcing far off their port side, a sign that fighters were closer than expected. At RAF Fighter Command, controllers managed a mosaic of incoming data. They listened to radar updates, pilot reports, and coastal readings, merging them into a coherent tactical picture. The room vibrated with overlapping voices, measured, controlled, never panicked. Controllers issued calm instructions, vector headings, intercept cues, safe altitude corridors. Their roles stitched every part of the system together, turning data from radar stations into guidance that could save lives or intercept enemies. Elsewhere in the night, a Luftwaffe Bf-110 night fighter climbed to intercept what German command believed was a returning RAF bomber group. But as the fighter approached its target area, it suddenly received unexpected contact, an RAF Mosquito closing in from behind. The German pilot tried a defensive turn, confident that such a maneuver in darkness would shake pursuit. Yet the Mosquito stayed locked on, guided not by vision, but by radar precision. It was the first sign to the German pilot that the British could track him even through evasive maneuvers. On the ground, members of the Royal Observer Corps listened intently from dispersed stations. Their role had diminished compared to radar, but their observations remained valuable for low-altitude tracking. They recorded engine types, rough bearings, and unexpected course shifts. Their reports flowed back into the main system, providing an extra layer of confirmation. Even as radar dominated, these human observers remained a stabilizing force. Back in the Mosquito, the echoes on the AI Mark IV grew sharper. The operator calmly read off updated distances, closing fast, slight altitude change, steady heading. The pilot prepared for visual acquisition, understanding that the final seconds still required human eyes. But the initial guidance, the invisible pathway through the night, came entirely from the radar. The crew's confidence grew. They knew the system worked, not by chance, but by design. In the bomber stream, another German crew witnessed a sudden, bright flash below, a night fighter strike on one of their own. The navigator checked their position again, recalculating, trying to understand how the British had reached them so deep and so fast. What unsettled them most was the timing. The British arrived earlier than predicted by standard defense models. For the first time, the Luftwaffe crews began to suspect that radar was not merely detecting them, it was hunting them. Back at the command center, the operations table shifted rapidly as tracking markers moved across the board. Controllers issued new vectors, tightening the noose around remaining Luftwaffe aircraft. Radar stations fed constant updates. Airborne crews provided confirmations. The system was acting as a living network, each component reinforcing the others. What once seemed experimental was now operating at near operational maturity. Across these interwoven perspectives, a singular truth emerged. The night was no longer a shield. Every radar operator, observer, pilot, and controller played a role in revealing what German engineers had long denied. Darkness had surrendered its advantage. For the Luftwaffe, the realization was spreading, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. The British radar network had turned the night into a contested battleground.
Shortly after midnight, the tension across Britain's night defense network reached its peak. Radar stations on the coast broadcast steady updates as Luftwaffe bombers began their withdrawal across the Channel. This phase of the raid was often the most vulnerable. German crews were fatigued, their formations scattered, and their fuel reserves low. But tonight, the RAF was ready. The combined accuracy of ground radar and airborne AI Mark IV systems created a level of tracking that German doctrine had never anticipated. A Mosquito locks on. A Mosquito night fighter patrolling near the North Sea coast received a clean radar return at 3 miles. The AI operator's tone sharpened. This was no faint signal, but a strong, steady echo that indicated an aircraft moving on a predictable bearing. The pilot rolled into a shallow turn and increased throttle, guiding the aircraft into an interception corridor. The sensation was almost surreal, chasing a target the crew could not yet see, but whose presence was certain. German crew feels the pressure. Inside the Luftwaffe bomber, a Ju-88 crew began to sense something was wrong. The radio operator detected sporadic interference again, more persistent than before. The navigator checked their altitude and course, confident they were following the return route correctly. Yet the pilot reported an unsettled feeling, an intuition that something was closing in on them. Still, they followed their training, maintained course, maintain discipline, trust the darkness. AI radar brings the fighter within striking distance. The Mosquito closed the distance steadily, guided solely by the ghostly movements on the AI radar display. The operator watched the blip grow stronger, the angle narrowing. At 1 mile, the operator gave precise updates. Target steady. range closing, slightly below. This accuracy would have been unthinkable only a year earlier. The combination of improved magnetron stability and practiced interpretation meant the crew could maneuver with clinical precision. Visual contact. The night breaks open. At roughly 800 yards, the pilot finally glimpsed the faint silhouette of the Ju-88, a darker shape against an already black sky. The Mosquito dipped slightly, positioning itself just below and behind the bomber to avoid detection. This final visual confirmation was the last step in a sequence that radar had orchestrated from the very beginning. The pilot released a controlled burst from the 4 Hispano 20mm cannons. The shells tore into the bomber's port engine, which erupted in flame. The Luftwaffe realizes the truth. The German crew reacted instantly, attempting a shallow dive to escape. But the fire spread rapidly, and their banks and turns did nothing to break the Mosquito's radar lock. The navigator urgently recalculated bearings, trying to understand where the British fighter had come from. Their defensive maneuvers, once effective in confusing visual pursuers, did little against an enemy guided by invisible waves. For the first time, they confronted the reality that British radar was not merely detecting them, it was guiding fighters with lethal accuracy. Multi-station coordination confirmed the kill. Back at the radar station, the operators observed 2 blips merge briefly, followed by a rapid descent marker on the German Echo. They marked the update, passed it to controllers, and shifted focus to the next incoming track. This seamless transition reflected how mature the system had become. The RAF no longer relied on luck or isolated skill. It had crafted a coordinated network that could identify, track, intercept, and confirm engagement, all in near real time. The breaking point in German assumptions. As reports from multiple German crews confirmed similar experiences, the Luftwaffe realized their long-standing assumptions were collapsing. Their belief that British radar was primitive, inaccurate, and ineffective at night could no longer stand. Darkness was no longer a refuge. The British had achieved what many in Germany considered impossible: a fully integrated night fighter interception system that combined ground radar, airborne radar, and command coordination into a seamless whole. The moment the sky changed sides. This single engagement, echoed by others across the night, became symbolic of a deeper transformation. It represented the moment when the night, once the Luftwaffe's greatest ally, began to betray them. For the German crews, the psychological impact was profound. They now flew knowing that the British could find them even in the deepest darkness. For Britain, it marked the culmination of years of relentless experimentation and determination. The climax sets the stage for consequences. The destruction of the Ju-88 was not simply a tactical victory. It was evidence that the balance of technological power had shifted. Radar, once dismissed by the Axis as unreliable, was now dictating the terms of night combat. And as more bombers fell, it became clear that the turning point had arrived, not through sheer force, but through precision, coordination, and innovation.
As the remaining Luftwaffe bombers crossed back toward occupied Europe, the tactical outcome of the night's engagements became unmistakable. The RAF had not merely disrupted the bomber stream, they had systematically tracked, engaged, and broken apart multiple segments of it. Interceptions were no longer rare or opportunistic. They were the result of measured coordination between radar stations, night fighter crews, and command centers. This demonstrated that the British night defense system had matured into a cohesive operational force. When surviving Luftwaffe crews landed at their bases in France and the Low Countries, Their debriefings reflected an unfamiliar tone. Reports described British fighters appearing without warning, from impossible angles, or with precision inconsistent with nighttime conditions. Technical officers collecting data noted repeated references to radar interference and coordinated attacks. These accounts contradicted earlier convictions that British radar lacked the resolution needed for nighttime interception. Impact on Luftwaffe strategy. Within weeks, Luftwaffe planners were forced to reassess their assumptions. The night raids had once been considered a low-risk strategy, offering a way to strike British targets without suffering unsustainable losses. But now, the emerging pattern indicated real danger. Even modest interception rates posed long-term challenges. Every lost bomber represented a crew that had to be replaced, training hours that had to be invested, and production lines that were already under pressure. Night operations were no longer the safe corridor they had been. Britain recognized its advantage. At RAF Fighter Command, senior officers reviewed the night's performance and recognized that their integrated system was not merely functional, it was operationally transformative. Round radar detected, controllers assessed, night fighters pursued, airborne radar executed the final intercept. Each component reinforced the next. This synergy reduced gaps in the defensive chain, creating a multi-layered shield that proved resilient even against large and complex enemy formations. Technological legitimacy established. The successes of these operations validated years of research into airborne interception. Engineers who had once struggled with unreliable prototypes now had proof that their technologies could determine the outcome of major engagements. The AI-Mk4 radar, chain-home network, and Dowding-based command structure had merged into a singular strategic asset. What began as an experimental concept was now a mature weapon system shaping the wider course of the air war. Psychological shift in the skies. The psychological implications were equally significant. British crews gained confidence from their ability to locate and engage targets in total darkness. German crews, conversely, now faced an environment where the darkness no longer guaranteed safety. On subsequent missions, Luftwaffe pilots flew with greater caution, altering routes, altitudes, and formations in hopes of disrupting British tracking. Yet these adjustments had limited effect against a system built to adapt rapidly. The strategic consequence solidifies. The RAF's improved night defense system contributed to a growing realization within German command that air superiority over Britain was no longer achievable. Even if raids continued, they would do so under increasing risk. The British radar network had effectively reduced the strategic value of night bombing by shrinking the window of safety the darkness once provided. It was a shift that rippled through the Luftwaffe's operational planning. A new era of air defense. This night marked more than a tactical victory. It marked the establishment of a new era. Radar, once dismissed or underestimated, had become central to Britain's air defense architecture. The Luftwaffe's discovery of its true capability represented a watershed moment. The night sky, once dictated by darkness, was now governed by radio waves, coordination, and technological precision.
When dawn broke over Britain, the quiet fields and coastlines bore no visible trace of the invisible struggle that had unfolded hours before. Radar operators returned to their barracks, night fighter crews landed in low-lit hangars, and plotting rooms reset their boards.
Yet everyone involved sensed that something profound had changed. The night air war was no longer a contest of darkness versus determination. It had become a contest of knowledge, of who understood the sky, the signals, and the machinery guiding them. The British success was not the product of a single breakthrough or sudden stroke of fortune. It came from years of trial, error, adaptation, and resilience. Early radar systems were crude and inconsistent. Airborne versions were heavy and temperamental. Crews trained under stressful conditions, often uncertain whether their equipment would hold up during missions. But each challenge produced refinements, and each refinement strengthened the larger system. The reflection of that perseverance could be seen in the night's outcome. For the Luftwaffe, the night's events forced a reconsideration of their earlier assumptions. They had long believed that technology alone could not overcome the inherent difficulties of nighttime air combat. In their view, human skill, not instrumentation, defined the night. But the British had shown that technology, when integrated intelligently and used with discipline, could reshape even the darkest environment. The night had become legible, mapped through signals and waveforms rather than moonlight. The Luftwaffe's earlier dismissal of British radar was not malicious, but rooted in the limited information available at the time. Intelligence reports often lagged behind developments, and early versions of Chain Home genuinely did have limitations. Yet the price of underestimating an evolving technology became clear. As the British system improved, German assumptions remained anchored in outdated assessments. The gap between perception and reality widened until it became a tactical disadvantage. The night's success also reflected the contributions of thousands of individuals working in concert. Radar scientists developed the underlying principles. Engineers crafted operational systems. Operators interpreted signals in real time. Controllers coordinated responses. Pilots executed interceptions under great risk. No single person or group could claim credit. The system functioned only because its parts were integrated with precision and discipline. The events of this night signaled the arrival of a new era in air combat, one where visibility was no longer the dominant factor. Radar blurred the boundary between night and day, transforming darkness into a navigable space. The implications extended far beyond Britain, influencing doctrines, research, and strategies across the world. Nations began to understand that future wars would be shaped not just by aircraft and armaments, but by sensors, signals, and information networks. As historians later examined this period, they highlighted a crucial truth. The night war over Europe was shaped as much by learning and adaptation as by firepower. The British radar system did not guarantee victory on its own, nor did it make night flying safe or simple. But it changed the balance enough to alter the Luftwaffe strategy and preserve the viability of Britain's defense. The outcome was not decisive in a single night, but cumulative across many. In the broader context of the war, the British radar revolution demonstrated the impact of scientific collaboration and institutional perseverance. It showed that underestimated technologies can grow into decisive instruments. It also showed that assumptions, no matter how reasonable at the time, must evolve with new evidence. When the Luftwaffe realized the truth, it was not in a laboratory or an intelligence report, but in the sky, where radar transformed darkness into a battlefield they no longer controlled.
In the aftermath of the night's engagements, both sides sifted through reports to understand what had happened. Britain saw confirmation that its integrated system could operate effectively, even under the most demanding conditions. Germany saw evidence that their earlier evaluations had overlooked a critical shift. The night's events were not merely tactical successes or failures. They were indicators of a deeper transformation in how air warfare was conducted.
Radar had proven to be more than a supporting tool. It had become a strategic enabler, shaping the timing, direction, and outcome of engagements. For the Luftwaffe, this forced a rethinking of their reliance on darkness as a defensive shield. For the RAF, it underscored the importance of maintaining technological momentum, ensuring that their capabilities stayed ahead of evolving threats. The night sky itself had become a contested space, no longer controlled solely by moonlight or cloud cover, but by invisible waves and synchronized systems that could detect, track, and intercept with increasing precision. It represented a shift from the intuitive to the analytical, from pilots relying on instinct to systems relying on data. In intelligence circles, the events of this night triggered renewed interest in understanding enemy capabilities. British analysts pressed for further development of airborne radar. German analysts redirected resources toward understanding and countering the technology they had underestimated. Both sides recognized that the future of air combat would be shaped by who could gather, interpret, and act on information fastest. Even so, radar was never a perfect solution. Its early systems were limited in range, resolution, and stability. Operators required skill and patience. Pilots needed precision and discipline. But when combined effectively, these imperfect tools formed a coherent whole, one strong enough to alter the balance of night warfare. As the war progressed, the lessons of this night reverberated through military circles. It taught that information and coordination could outweigh numerical superiority. It demonstrated the importance of adaptability, especially in rapidly evolving technological environments. And it reminded commanders that underestimating an adversary, especially a technologically innovative one, could carry significant consequences. This reflection framed the night's events not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger transformation. Radar had not eliminated danger, but it had reshaped the risk landscape. Darkness no longer guaranteed protection. Safety depended on knowledge, organization, and the ability to interpret the unseen. For the men on both sides, these realizations came not through abstract theory, but through lived experience. They felt the consequences in the cockpit, in the radar room, and on the return flight home. And in those experiences, the broader meaning of the radar war began to take shape, a conflict fought as much with mathematics and magnetrons as with engines and ammunition.
In the decades following the war, historians would trace many of the modern world's air defense principles back to nights like this one. The British radar system demonstrated how technology, when properly integrated across detection, communication, and interception, could redefine the terms of conflict. It foreshadowed a future where information dominance would often matter as much as physical strength. The Luftwaffe's experience also offered a lasting lesson. Dismissing a technology based on outdated information can be costly. While German engineers developed powerful radar systems of their own, their early assessments of British capabilities shaped strategic decisions that proved difficult to reverse. In the complex dance of wartime innovation, timing and perception mattered as much as invention. For the RAF, the success of the integrated radar network validated the decision to invest heavily in research and development, even during times of crisis. It showed that long-term planning and interdisciplinary cooperation could yield decisive advantages. This philosophy influenced Allied strategies throughout the remainder of the war and set the stage for post-war aviation and defense systems. The legacy of this night also lived on in countless technologies that emerged in its wake.
improved airborne radar, ground-controlled interceptions, early warning satellites, and modern integrated air defense networks. The foundation laid during the early 1940s shaped the Cold War and beyond, demonstrating how invisible systems could influence visible outcomes. Yet perhaps the most significant legacy is the reminder that understanding, true, unbiased, evidence-based understanding, is one of the most powerful assets in any conflict. The Axis engineers who once scoffed at Allied radar underestimated its potential because they measured it only by its early limitations. The night sky revealed the price of that miscalculation. As the documentary closes, the lesson becomes clear. Technology evolves, assumptions expire, and the battlefield constantly shifts. In the early years of World War II, the night belonged to those who believed darkness offered protection. But by 1942, that belief was obsolete. The night had changed sides, claimed not by shadows, but by signals, coordination, and human determination.